This function, which you've outlined, does have consequences, and it either leads to government shutdown or the increasing use of continuing resolutions or CRs. Could you tell us a little bit more about what a continuing resolution is, and give us a little bit about the history?
Okay. A continuing resolution is literally a short-term appropriation. It is an appropriation typically which covers a portion of a fiscal year, and the reason it's called a continuing resolution is because it is allowing agencies to continue to spend at the level that they already are spending. That's a kind of classic continuing resolution. So if you had an appropriation for fiscal year 2012 and you had a continuing resolution for fiscal year 2013, it would just say continue doing all the stuff in fiscal year 2013 that you were doing in fiscal year 2012, but you can't do anything new, and you can't stop doing anything that you were already doing. So that's a kind of classic continuing resolution. Now the history here is a little bit interesting because continuing resolutions have been around for a long time. I mean, there are continuing resolutions I think have been around for most of this century. But there was no particular consequence to failing to enact appropriation bills by the beginning of the fiscal year until 1980, when the Attorney General at that time, Benjamin Civiletti, who was President Carter's last Attorney General, issued an opinion, and that opinion essentially said federal agencies are not permitted to enter into obligations, that is, to spend money in absence of an appropriation. Believe it or not, prior to that, even if there had not been an appropriation passed by the beginning of the fiscal year, federal agencies would continue to spend money because essentially they were taking the position that Congress couldn't have meant that. Congress couldn't have meant to stop funding them. But the Attorney General said you can't make the assumption that Congress didn't mean that. The fact is that if there's not an appropriation, you don't have the legal authority to spend money. So after that point, after 1980, if agencies didn't have appropriations, it meant they had to cease operations. Now, of course, this then led to sort of obvious questions, which is, okay, what if you're in the middle of a war? Do you at midnight on September 30th just kind of put your guns away and leave the battlefield because you don't have an appropriation? So this led to the whole concept of exceptions and the fact that there were essential services that needed to continue, and then the question sort of came down to, okay, well, what is essential and what is non-essential? Initially, there was a pretty broad definition of what was essential, but then there was a kind of separate opinion that said, this idea of essentiality, if you will, was not quite as elastic a concept as people might think, and so we had kind of much tighter rules in terms of what's essential and not essential. But the main issue, and really one of the main issues that I was trying to focus on in this report, is just to kind of shine light on the fact that it has become the norm rather than the rule to have continuing resolutions, and that the impacts of those continuing resolutions are relatively invisible. What you are trying to avoid is very visible. That is, a government shutdown, even if it doesn't encompass the whole government, it always led to things like a padlock on the gates at Yellowstone National Park, people not being able to do things, people going to Social Security offices to file for new benefits and, there was no one home. So all of those things were visible. But the effect of continuing resolutions is more sort of invisible, and we'll get into this more later, I know, but the motivation for sort of talking about this is that this is not a world where government shutdowns are bad, but continuing resolutions are okay. It's a matter of kind of which bad you want to choose, because the continuing resolutions have their own sort of costs.
And I'd like to talk about that because your recent report for the IBM Center does a wonderful job of explaining how simple CRs have given way to complex CRs.
Right.
What are the issues now routinely addressed in CRs, and what are the implications of this added complexity?
Well, part of the problem is that it's not like what we have. What we end up with is a CR, and we know that it's going to cover a certain number of months in the year, and then at that point we'll have the appropriation. What has happened in many years is that you end up with multiple CRs, and some of those CRs might cover 10 days, 2 weeks, And, so you just go from one CR to another. I mean, there have been years where there have been 10 or 15 separate CRs relatively short. So I think one of the things that's happened over time is that we've gotten into this kind of serial CR, for a particular fiscal year where, okay, we have one CR, it expires on this date, then we're going to have another one, then we're going to have another one, then we're going to have another one. And that makes it more and more difficult for agencies to plan. But the other thing that makes it difficult is that if you have a CR and you have a situation where what is occurring in the fiscal year that the CR covers is that programs are expanding for some reason, the CR doesn't permit that unless you actually put language in the CR saying that would happen. A very specific example, we have lots of veterans coming home from Iraq and Afghanistan at this point. So to just say that we're going to continue the level of funding for the Department of Veterans Affairs at the same level as it has in the past when the veterans population is growing is not going to actually account for that increase. So you either have to somehow scale back on the services you would provide, or you have to have an exception in the CR that says, well, it's continuing at the current rate, except we're going to allow the Department of Veterans Affairs budget to increase. So part of what happens and part of the complexity stems from the fact that whenever anybody knows we're going to have a CR, then you have all of these requests that come in for what agencies refer to as anomalies. And anomalies are simply exceptions to the general rule of the CR. So everybody thinks that they're special. And so everybody requests an anomaly, and then there's all kinds of time that's spent between the White House, the Office of Management and Budget, the Congress, in terms of sort of deciding, well, okay, who's going to get an exception to the CR and who isn't going to get an exception to the CR.